7 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order June 23, 2022, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Need to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. With regard to interpretation, for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair, and for members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can and appreciate your patience and your understanding. Please also note that during the meeting, it is not permitted to take pictures in the room or screenshots on Zoom. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning technical tests for witnesses, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required tests. Should any technical challenges arise, please let me know, and then we will suspend to ensure that everybody has full translation. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, February 2022, the committee is beginning a study of environmental and human rights consideration regarding Canadian mining firms abroad. I welcome all of our witnesses here today and to our colleagues who are all here. We have with Mining Watch Canada, Catherine Coumans, Research Coordinator by video conference. From Oxfam Canada, Ian Thompson, Manager of Policy. And Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, we have Lisa McDonald, Executive Director by video conference, and Jeff Killeen, Director, Policy and Programs by video conference. And I'm told that the Prospectors and Developers Association are with us just for an hour, so we will try and ensure that committee members get their questions asked before you have to depart. All right, we will welcome you all and start with a round of questions. Dr. Coumans, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Since 1999, Mining Watch Canada has been working with mining-affected communities and Indigenous peoples struggling to protect their human rights and their environment from egregious impacts and abuses by Canadian mining companies operating in Africa, Latin America, and the Asia-Pacific region. For over 20 years, we have been dealing with brutal realities. Violent evictions of Indigenous peoples from their homes by mine personnel, shootings of local men and boys, and brutal rapes of women and girls by mine security, as well as the use of forced labor in places such as Papua New Guinea, Tanzania, Guatemala, and Eritrea. We work with communities facing health crises and loss of food security because of rivers and groundwater contaminated by mine waste, as well as pollution of soil and air from mineral processing at mine sites. We grieve with communities over the loss of Indigenous sacred sites and over the loss of life due to catastrophic tailings dam failures in places such as the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Argentina, and the Philippines. These environmental and human rights abuses have not diminished in the 23 years that I have been working at Mining Watch Canada. Year after year, the mining industry is expanding its global footprint, often in countries with weak governance, in search of new lucrative ore bodies, expanding into ever more remote, often Indigenous territories and into critical ecosystems, such as the Amazon, the Paramos, and glaciers. And year after year, we are confronted with new communities desperately seeking protection from the harm they endure because of the operations of a Canadian exploration company, junior or senior mining company, in places such as Kyrgyzstan, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, and small islands in Indonesia and the Pacific. The common denominator that ties together these human rights and environmental abuses by Canadian mining companies operating overseas is lack of accountability. We are not talking about a few bad apples here. We are talking about a systemic reality in which Canadian mining companies, large and small, are operating with effective impunity, impunity which enables and drives further abuses. Since 1997, 9 cases have been filed in Canadian courts against Cambior, Copper Mesa, Anvil, Hudbay, Tahoe, and Nevson for allegations arising from their overseas operations. These cases concern assaults, shootings, gang rapes of local Indigenous people by mine security, and the use of slave labor and the contamination of a river by mine waste. These are just the tip of the iceberg of egregious harm inflicted, as it remains extremely difficult to overcome formidable legal hurdles such as forum nonconvenience and the corporate veil to bring cases in Canada. The most recent case filed in Canada was just in November of 2022 and is against Barrick Gold, a member of the Mining Association of Canada. This is the third case filed against Barrick and its subsidiaries since 2015 on behalf of victims of violence by mine security and police guarding Barrick's North Mara gold mine in Tanzania. We are talking about rape, killing, and maiming of local Kuria people by mine security, and these reports have been repeatedly reported since at least 2009. Additionally, villages are currently being forcibly evicted to make way for mine expansion. Under armed police guard, distraught parents and children look on in horror as their homes are bulldozed while clothes are still drying on the line. There is no resettlement plan for these already vulnerable Indigenous people who now face homelessness and food insecurity. Since 2007, 5 UN treaty bodies have focused specifically on harm caused by Canadian mining companies operating overseas and have reminded Canada of its duty to protect human rights at home and abroad. In 2016, the International Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights asked Canada to develop a legal framework that affords legal remedies to people who have been the victims of activities of such corporations operating abroad. That was a quote. Canada must finally take comprehensive and effective action. We know what must be done. Canada must implement mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation as detailed in Private Members Bill C-262, tabled in March of 2022. And Canada must give the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise investigatory powers to compel witness testimony and documents, as committed to by the government in 2018 and as proposed by a majority of members of the Foreign Affairs Committee in their report of June of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Thompson, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all members of the committee for inviting Oxfam here today. My name is Ian Thompson, and I'm the Manager of Policy at Oxfam Canada. Oxfam Canada and Oxfam Quebec are part of a global confederation active in 87 countries around the world, working to fight poverty and inequality. We put gender justice and women's rights at the heart of everything we do. Together with civil society partners and people's movements around the world, Oxfam is working for greater accountability in the mining, oil, and gas sectors because we've seen firsthand how these industries can exacerbate inequality if left unregulated. Oxfam has documented an entrenched gender bias in the mining, oil, and gas industries, whereby women, girls, and gender-diverse people are less likely to derive benefits, such as well-paid jobs, contracting opportunities, compensation for land use, and they're also at greater risk of being harmed from gender-based violence, housing shortages, and other things that particularly affect women living in poverty. It's not only Oxfam who is observing this troubling pattern. Last year, the Responsible Mining Foundation published a report that revealed the mining industry had made little to no progress on gender equality. It reviewed the practices of dozens of major mining companies against 16 different metrics and assessed over 250 mine sites around the world. Sadly, no Canadian mining company made it into the top 10 list of those taking action on gender equality. Now, Canadian parliamentarians have spent the past 2 decades holding periodic studies into the harmful impacts of Canadian mining firms operating abroad. And yet Parliament has failed to enact any meaningful legislation to address the problem. Since the time that Mr. Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister, human rights defenders from the Philippines, Congo, Guatemala, Mexico, and countless other countries have met with parliamentarians to tell them firsthand about the human rights violations associated with Canadian corporate activity abroad, be it targeted killings, forced displacements, gang rape, forced labor, and other egregious violations of human dignity. However, the federal government, regardless of the party in power, has shown a complete lack of political will in setting clear, enforceable norms for the industry when operating abroad. So what's going to be different this time? How will the members of this committee distinguish this study from others that came before it? We believe there is a new urgency to take action here in Canada to address these governance gaps. If we're not doing business to the highest ethical standards, we will alienate our trading partners and fail to gain the support of local communities to host the mines of tomorrow. Our Deputy Prime Minister has spoken about deepening trading relationships with Canada's friends, but we won't strengthen our friendships if our companies operate abroad with little regard for human rights and the environment. On the contrary, it's bad business and bad diplomacy to rely solely on voluntary measures when it comes to responsible business conduct. Oxfam would like to present 3 policy recommendations that we believe this committee should endorse to increase accountability and responsible conduct in the mining sector. The first recommendation is to adopt new legislation in Canada that would mandate Canadian companies to conduct comprehensive due diligence around human rights and the environment in their operations and their global supply chains. Oxfam recently submitted a brief to the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee outlining our priorities for such legislation. In short, Canada should ensure its legislation covers all human rights, all sectors of our economy, and provide redress for people who believe their rights have been violated by Canadian companies. Fortunately, the Prime Minister has already asked Labour Minister O'Regan to table such legislation in the current session of Parliament. To date, the Minister has not outlined how he will be advancing this part of his mandate and would likely welcome advice from this committee. Oxfam's second recommendation is to strengthen the Office of the Canadian Ombudsperson on Responsible Enterprise, which was announced by this government 5 years ago and has yet to fully investigate any Canadian mining companies. Why is that? Because people who believe they've been harmed by Canadian mining companies are not bringing complaints to the core because the government has given the office a very weak mandate and hindered it from conducting thorough and independent investigations. A strengthened ombudsperson could go a long way towards improving respect for human rights in the mining sector. Our third recommendation is for Canada to adopt an explicit feminist foreign policy without delay. A feminist foreign policy would help to ensure our international trade dimensions of our foreign policy are living up to Canada's feminist aspirations. Trade agreements would then introduce binding clauses on realizing gender equality and human rights, not just voluntary clauses on corporate social responsibility. By taking such actions, we believe Canada will raise the bar on its mining industry and ensure people who are most at risk from mining operations will no longer be harmed and will benefit from resource development. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Ms. MacDonald, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. Thank you for inviting PDAC to appear today on behalf of Canada's mineral exploration industry. I first want to acknowledge that I come to you from Toronto on the traditional lands of the Huron, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Oneida peoples, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and all of the Indigenous nations that have lived on these lands over the centuries. The Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, PDAC, is the leading voice of the mineral exploration and development industry with over 6,000 members in Canada and around the world, including nearly 1,000 corporate members. Notably, Canada's mineral industry consists of more than 1,100 public companies, representing 1/3 of all listings on Canadian exchanges. We understand that the Canadian mineral industry is a key component of our economy, and that the demand for critical minerals will increase substantially as jurisdictions around the globe attempt to lower carbon emissions and expand renewable energy sources. There is simply no energy transition without minerals, and PDAC focuses our work on supporting a competitive, responsible, and sustainable mineral industry that can help drive this change. With these hallmarks in mind, the objectives and strategic goals of our association align with the recently released Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy. We recognize how establishing new critical minerals supply chains will be a catalyst for economic growth and create well-paying employment opportunities across our country and in many regions around the world. We also understand that mineral explorers and developers working at home and abroad must continue to evolve best practice to attract the people, access the land, and generate the capital needed for Canada's critical minerals strategy and a sustainable future to become a reality. From governments, there must be clearly defined development pathways for viable critical mineral deposits in Canada in order to meet our emission, conservation, and biodiversity-related objectives. From industry, we must continue to ingrain environmental, social, and governance standards into the mineral exploration and development process that place human rights as a central pillar. Such actions can lay groundwork for collaborating with other nations and allow Canadian companies to export responsible mineral exploration and development activities around the world. Part of our work at PDAC is to develop tools that support industry, and 2023 marks the 20th anniversary of what we originally named E3 and now E3+, a framework for responsible exploration. This guidance suite provides mineral exploration companies with the tools needed to improve their social, environmental, and health and safety performance. This framework includes specific content on human rights, environmental stewardship, and outlines how to conduct risk assessments to identify potential direct and indirect impacts on human rights in advance of exploration. E3+ also outlines how companies should review and update risk assessments regularly as they move through different stages of the exploration process. PDAC has actively engaged and supported the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, CORE, in developing its mandate. We also remain committed to working with Global Affairs Canada, NRCan, the CORE, and the Trade Commissioner's Service and others to ensure that Canada's mining and exploration sector can continue to be a global leader in sustainable and responsible practices. We are widely recognized for the PDAC annual convention that brings mineral explorers, developers, and miners from more than 100 countries together in one place to connect. Convention programming provides a venue to share perspectives, offer professional education, and create a collaborative environment to share best practices. Our suite of programs for 2023 includes Changing Global Rules, the impact of EU's raw materials strategy, which will see European representatives discuss the impact of governmental strategies on Canadian mineral exploration companies operating in and outside the EU. We also offer Navigating Complex Waters, Tools for Security, Conflict, and Human Rights, which is a session tailored specifically towards providing guidance to mineral exploration and mining companies on respecting human rights and operational security. We have sent invitations to all Canadian parliamentarians to attend PDAC 2023, and we certainly encourage members of this committee to attend our convention and, in particular, take part in our dedicated sustainability program. This program will host the sessions I just mentioned, plus other topics ranging from ESG disclosure, cooperative agreement development, and creating harassment-free work environments that are safe for all. We will be sure to send this invitation directly to the committee's clerk to ensure it is at your disposal. Our association does not ignore the fact that the mineral exploration and mining industry has made missteps in the past. However, in the vast majority of cases, Canadian companies operate to the highest standards both within and outside of Canada. PDAC and our E3+ framework, along with other cohort associations like the Mining Association of Canada, who is not able to be here with us today, and their Towards Sustainable Mining initiative are built expressly to help accelerate adoption of best practice in regions that may have less regulatory oversight and to export Canadian values abroad. Thank you for your time. My colleague Jeff Colleen and I welcome any questions.
Very much, Ms. McDonald. On to our members. Mr. Baldinelli for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. I'm going to begin with a little preamble. In January of 2018, the federal government announced the creation of both the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, also known as CORE, and the creation of a multi-stakeholder advisory board called the Advisory Body on Responsible Business Conduct to advise the government of matters of responsible business conduct abroad. Through the briefing materials, and they were excellent, thank you, that we received from our analysts, I understand that 2 of the 3 witnesses present today had a role on this advisory board. Both the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada was named as a member in the government background document from 2018, and Mining Watch Canada was referenced in a news release published on Amnesty International Canada's website on July 11th, 2019. Just a simple yes or no. Can both organizations please confirm that they were members of this advisory board between the dates of January 17th, 2018 and July 19th, 2019? Ms. Comden? Ms. McDonald, can you just confirm?
Yes, I can confirm on behalf of PDAC.
Mining Watch Canada was a member of the MSAB in a backup position.
Okay, thank you. I was just, the Amnesty news release identified Mining Watch Canada as one of 14 civil society and labor unions to unanimously resign from this advisory board on July 11th, 2019. According to the release, the reason for this mass resignation was due to the erosion of trust and confidence in the Liberal government's commitment to international corporate accountability. It goes on to read, the CORE remains without meaningful power to serve impacted communities and workers. Civil society believes the government will not provide the promised investigatory powers before the upcoming federal elections. So my questions, and I'm going to begin first with Ms. Comden. What frustrations did Mining Watch Canada and other civil society and labor groups have towards the Liberal government and its position at this time?
Thank you for that question. Yes, that's going back a ways, but I think it's a very important question because in 2018, the Government of Canada made a commitment in the creation of the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise that this officer would have the investigatory powers to compel documents and compel witnesses. Yet a year later, when Sherry Meyerhofer was installed as the first ombudsperson, she was not given those powers. And, this was on the Government of Canada's website that she would have these powers. She, in fact, took the position, assuming that she would have those powers, and she was not given those powers. This is critically important. The reason there was an erosion from the commitment that was made to what actually ended up happening when she was installed is because there was huge lobbying effort against those powers. And this is right in the public realm. The Mining Association of Canada made public statements that are in the media saying that they opposed the ombudsperson having those powers. And the reason it's so critically important that she had those powers is because without those, you have a he said, she said situation where the community says, our animals are dying when they drink from this river. We can't bathe in the river. We get sores. And the company says, oh, we've done testing and it's fine. But they don't have to provide those documents.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for
your comments. Yeah. I'm just going to follow up on another question to you, just to build on that. And so, would you say that Mining Watch Canada felt deceived by the government in terms of the establishment of this advisory body? Would it be fair to say that that this body was more set up at a period in time for political reasons coming into a federal election rather than to implement needed change?
I don't know if it was put in for political reasons, but what I do know is that when we participated in that body, it became very clear very quickly that the issues that really needed to be dealt with, the fact that the Corps needed to have the powers that she needed, the fact that we needed to start talking about legislation, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, were not going to be addressed in that committee. There were a lot of problems with the way it was set up, with the types of issues that were being proposed, and it was held very strictly by the Secretariat. We had very little input on what was actually going to be discussed. And so when it became very clear that the ombudsperson was not going to be granted the powers that she needed to be able to be effective, there was a resignation of all the civil society and union members.
On that, I guess in the Amnesty International news release from July 11th, 2019, Emily Dwyer from the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability was quoted as saying, "Without independence and investigatory powers, the Corps amounts to nothing more than a broken promise." Do you agree it was a broken promise by this Liberal government?
Oh, it was definitely a broken promise. It was more than a promise. It was a commitment. This was actually publicly stated by the Government of Canada. It was, at that time, the minister was Philippe Champagne, and it was made very publicly. And in fact, when the commitment was broken, there was a further process. There was actually someone hired to look at the judicial aspects of providing the Corps with those powers. And there was a report that came out of that, and that report was withheld. And that report was leaked during hearings in 2021. And in that report, it was clear that those powers could be granted and that the Corps would be more effective with those powers.
Thank
so
you
this was
very
in the committee hearings in 2021 around the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you. On to Mr. Aria, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question would be for Ms. Lisa MacDonald of the Prospectors and Developer Association. First of all, I would like to place on record my appreciation for the contributions of mining sector to our country's prosperity and the standard of living that we currently enjoy. Some of us who live in urban centers with comfortable paychecks and our comfortable homes, we don't really appreciate the hard work done by those working in the mining sector, the men and women in the mining sector in tough physical environment. The mining companies and the several generations of Canadians who have worked for the mining companies have contributed greatly to our current status in the world. According to the numbers I have in 2020, I think mining sector contributed to about $107 billion to GDP and had about $103 billion in export. I also understand the high amount of capital that is risked in prospecting and developing a mine, and the long-term nature of developing a single mine, and especially with, I think, almost 730 of Canadian 1,350 mining companies have operations abroad, and I know how tough it is to enter into these markets in Asia, Africa, and South America, and to operate there. So I would like to place on record the contributions of the mining sector to Canada's prosperity today. Not only in the past, we are once again banking on the mining sector going forward too. The single biggest technology change that is available to us to fight climate change is the energy transition to adopting battery-operated electric vehicles, and also to adopt a battery for the energy storage so that making our solar and wind energy projects much more viable. And again, we call upon mining sector to contribute in developing the critical minerals in Canada. We have announced our critical mineral strategy, which was, I think, in part developed in consultation with the mining sector in Canada. And on that, we can take discussions with Ms. MacDonald later on offline, because this study is on the operations abroad with 730 Canadian companies operating in many different countries, especially in South America and Africa. My question to Ms. MacDonald is, what are the kind of competition you are finding these days to go abroad in developing mines? Having born in a developing country, I really appreciate the kind of economic development that mining projects bring to the local community, much better than any other aid given to these poor countries. So with the changing global scenario, what are the challenges and you are finding, what are the kind of competition you are finding for Canadian companies setting up mining projects in Africa, in South America and other countries?
Thank you. And certainly Canadian mining companies are operating in extremely complex environments around the world. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jeff Kleen, to elaborate.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much for that question. Thinking of our membership base, the exploration and development companies that operate in and outside of Canada, that is a critical part of the supply chain, and it is arguably one of the more capital and capital risky and labor intensive parts of the business. For a Canadian company to move outside of Canada, obviously, in most cases, these exploration companies that we do represent are smaller businesses. They would they'd be considered small or medium enterprises at best, and often have a relatively small management group. So, having the skills to be able to operate on the ground from a technical perspective is often where these companies come from. So learning the capacity to operate outside of Canada in foreign jurisdictions with different regulatory processes is not a small challenge in and of itself. And obviously something that we as an association try and help our members do with some of the pieces that Ms. McDonald mentioned already. But certainly it's a challenging environment for a small company that with a small contingency to look at a foreign country and a foreign regulatory process and be able to manage through that. Then you add on the fact that access to capital.
I got a quick one more question, short question to Ms. McDonald. Two things actually. One is that how is the availability of capital for Canadian small and medium-sized Canadian mining companies going abroad? And secondly, in any given sector, with the large number of companies operating, there will be some black sheep, I can call, companies who don't adhere to the code of conduct that your association prescribes to. What do you do in those cases?
So your first question with respect to access to capital, it is obviously something that is required for these businesses to move forward because most exploration companies are non-revenue generating. So without new investment coming into the company, there is really no feasibility moving forward. We have seen this market turn south or downturn with the overall broader markets in 2022, and the amount of capital raised by the sector generally was down, I think it was over 25-30% year over year. So the overall access to capital for junior exploration is starting to squeeze, arguably as well when you think of projects outside of gold and copper, some of the more traditional commodities, and looking into rare earths or some of the critical minerals, the lead time for exploration, the amount of time for development and that return to market for potential revenues is even more protracted. So it's even more challenging when a smaller company is looking for investment and they're looking for lithium or rare earths because that overall production scheme is more complex and the time is more expansive.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Sivard Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members, and good morning to my colleagues. I am very pleased, though perhaps that's not the right word, to be addressing this issue. I have visited mining regions in Chile and Colombia, and this is why I pushed for this committee to be tackled by for this committee to tackle this study. I've heard horror stories from local populations, the air and the soil being contaminated, people killed by private security companies, and often these projects, when they're accepted by local populations, are accepted due to promises of job development, and these promises are not kept because mines bring in their own personnel. Now, Madam McDonald from Mining Watch, I have a couple, Mrs. Coomans, is it true that these mining companies are often paper companies because the regulatory and tax environment and the Toronto Stock Exchange means that Canada is actually an attractive jurisdiction for Canadian companies to register in Canada?
Yeah, let me just answer two things. First of all, in my presentation, I gave an awful lot of variety of issues, both environmental and human rights, and I named many, many countries. All of those have actual cases behind them, and we will be providing a brief with far more information. So yes, there is a really big problem. And yes, there is also this very interesting phenomena where a lot of companies headquarter in Canada, but have not much more here than a mail office box. And in fact, I'm in Vancouver right now on exactly such a case. I'm here for a conference on the oceans, and Canada is now moving into deep seabed mining. And there's a Canadian company called the Metals Company that is pushing deep seabed mining to go ahead. And if you go to their headquarters, basically all you find there is a mailbox. There's no person there. We were there yesterday, or day before yesterday. So this is definitely an issue that companies headquarter in Canada for tax reasons. It's sometimes called snow washing, and there are other reasons as well. Expertise that exists in Canada, but have very little actual presence here.
Donc, un chantier sans doute à attaquer.
So this could be an issue to address. Now, you mentioned the Ombudsman, but I still would like to ask a question. Does the Ombudsman have sufficient power, yes or no?
No, we do not believe that she does, because she still does not have the powers 5 years after she was created to compel witnesses and to compel documents, something that the government of Canada recognized as critically important and committed that she would have those powers when the office was first announced.
And in 2009, the Bloc Québécois that I belong to had put in a motion to create a commission of inquiry that could have led its own inquiries and would have the power to compel witnesses to appear, including foreign affairs, to compel mining companies and foreign affairs, which takes me to a different question. Have you heard of any diplomatic support to Canadian mining companies abroad?
Diplomatic support to Canadian mining companies operating overseas through the Trade Commissioner Service is ongoing in all cases that we're aware of. And there's a really big problem of accountability there as well. There is something called an integrity assessment or agreement that mining companies are supposed to sign if they want to have Trade Commissioner support. But when we come across really egregious cases of human rights abuses or environmental abuses by a Canadian mining company, and we ask, and we know that there's been Trade Commissioner support, sometimes through access to information or very overtly through the media, when we ask, has this company signed such an integrity agreement, that's confidential information. So there's no way for us to hold either the company to account or even the government to account for how it is supporting this company quite overtly often. And yet this company is being accused of very egregious harms. So yes, Canadian companies get a lot of political support. It's not just financial support that they get, it's also political support. And this is also an issue of Canadian government accountability.
I notice, Mr. Killeen, you have your hand raised. This is Mr. Savard-Tremblay's time. Do you want Mr. Killeen to answer your question?
Tout d'abord, peut-être une autre question.
I think I have another question, and if we have time, I could let my colleague ask another one. 1 minute, okay? Do you have projects that violate human, social, and environmental rights that are supported by Export and Development Canada?
Madame Coumans.
Ms. Coumans?
Sorry, I didn't realize that question was for me. I'm not sure on the exploration side, certainly on the exploitation side, so on the majors that are mining companies that are operating overseas, yes.
Je veux juste préciser, en fait, ma question.
Just to clarify, I'm not speaking of exports as a sector, but the Civil Society Export and Development Canada.
Yes, as I said, I'm not aware of exploration companies that are supported by EDC, Export Development Canada, but I am aware that we have run into companies that are actually mining, so exploiting mines that have been supported by EDC.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the witnesses for being here, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, for bringing forward this motion. Just this is an issue that I've encountered numerous times in my time here in Ottawa. I was at the Parl-Americas meeting on the side of the Summit of the Americas meeting last spring in Los Angeles, and I talked to a number of Latin American parliamentarians. The woman from Chile, representing Chile there, all she wanted to talk about was Canada's terrible reputation in Chile with regards to mining. Similar comments from the representative from Guatemala. I've met with indigenous groups here in Ottawa from Colombia who, again, had serious problems with the conduct of Canadian mining companies in Colombia. So just with that background, I just would first like to ask Mr. Thompson, he mentioned three recommendations. One of them was to have new legislation to focus on companies that are not acting well now, and the second one was to strengthen the ombudsman's role in this. Those are two things that the NDP again has put forward private members' bills on both those. Peter Julian on the first and Heather McPherson on the second one. Are you familiar with those legislative efforts by the NDP and how well they match up with your recommendations?
Yes, thank you for that question. Oxfam Canada is aware of both of those private members' bills and fully supports them. We would like to see those changes brought about.
Okay, and can you maybe expand on both of those? Like you mentioned due diligence regarding human rights and providing redress. Do you have any, if you'd like to expand on that first one and how?
Certainly. Mr. Julian's bill really brings about the comprehensive due diligence framework that we believe Canada needs so that all of our companies are aware of their human rights responsibilities and are making sure that they are respecting human rights in all of their operations and throughout their global supply chains. At the moment, there is no enforceable standard. Some companies do it, many companies do not. And that puts a lot of Canadian investment at risk. It also puts a lot of people in harm's way, depending on where a Canadian company might be operating. So to have a consistent framework that covers all human rights and all companies would be expected to exercise this due diligence is an emerging global standard that we feel Canada must also adopt. We see the European Union is developing a due diligence framework, and we think that is going to be the trend. And we really have to get ahead of this, and our businesses really need to do this due diligence to ensure they're operating responsibly. On the ombudsperson, actually, we met with the ombudsperson on the first day she was appointed. Oxfam brought some partners from Mexico and Guatemala who had been harmed by Canadian mining companies to meet with Ms. Meyerhofer on the very first day to say, these problems are serious and this office is needed, but we are not confident that your mandate is sufficient to actually give us redress in the cases that we're facing. So we have been telling the government and the core since day one that we need stronger powers in order for that office to be effective. And we would welcome the passage of Heather McPherson's private members bill to strengthen that office.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I'd just like to turn to Ms. Coumans again to comment on both those actions, if she would like to expand on those two recommendations.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know that the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, which has over 40 members of organizations across Canada, created draft legislation. And that draft legislation was for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And that was adopted into the bill that Peter Julian tabled in March of last year, C-262. And then Heather McPherson's bill was on the core, that was 263. Just to briefly talk a little bit more about the mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence, what this bill would require is that companies headquartered in Canada would report regularly, probably yearly, on risk that they have established throughout their entire supply chain. So they have to look to see if there are human beings at risk or environments at risk through their operations and the operations of their subsidiaries and contractors. Then they have to report on the risk that they've identified. But beyond that, they have to also now address that risk. They have to actively make sure that if people are being abused, slave labor, but also all of the things that I talked about, forced evictions, killings by security guards, rapes, all of the things that are going on at various mining companies have to be addressed, not just reported on, but addressed. And then finally, the last really important point is that if those issues are not addressed, people can bring a court case to Canada. There will be a cause of action created through this legislation that allows people to bring a case against the parent company in Canada. So they don't have to worry about forum nonconvenience and they don't have to worry about the corporate veil. And
Thank you
that's
very much.
really important.
Thank you, Ms. Goomans. On
Thank
to
you.
Mr. Carey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I wanted to start with Ms. McDonald. You mentioned in your opening that you're a supporter of the rare earth mining. Now, we just did a study that involved the Inflation Reduction Act, and the United States and Canada is moving forward with mandates. The amount of money the Americans are putting into it, a credit of U.S. $3,750 for a vehicle containing electric battery, having specific percentages. And what's happening, those percentages are increasing. Like it's 40% by 2023, 50% 2024, 60 by 2025, 70 by 2026, 80 by 2027 and thereafter, which is significant. These are already called rare earth minerals. And I was just wondering, can we meet these governments' mandated targets for these electrical batteries? What's your opinion on that?
Certainly, as you say, we see that the demand for these kinds of minerals is ever increasing with the connection to that switch to the lower carbon energy sources. Jeff, if you can elaborate a little bit more on the complexity of critical mineral exploration development.
Yeah, certainly. And maybe just before I start, I would maybe want to offer as well, just to some of the comments we've heard that, where operating abroad, there's an inference here that there's, rampant human rights abuses or other types of actions. And I think we would argue that that's just not the case. There are certainly incidents that happen and there are assets and there are places in the world where we have seen, and as Lisa mentioned in her opening remarks, that's not something that we ignore as an association. But by and large, Canadian companies operating abroad do bring best practice to their operations. We are seeing our colleagues at MAC and TSM, the Towards Sustainable Mining Protocol, be brought out now to 9 different nations have signed on to that, which does require reporting on things like human rights. It requires assessments, and it is done through third-party verification. So we are seeing that grow within the Canadian marketplace more and more. But then thinking about rare earths specifically, rare earths actually aren't that rare in terms of where they can be found. My background is in geology. But the concentration of rare earths to a point where it is an economic deposit, that's where the challenge does mostly lie. Now, with respect to the timeline of what our demands look like at this day and age and what our capabilities to servicing those demands in terms of Canadian production, it doesn't look like we would have the capacity to feed into the marketplace the amount of lithium, rare earths, or graphites that are being projected forward. And that's why the critical mineral strategy here at home, as an evergreen document, is so important, and the intergovernmental coordination between our efforts to protect 30% of Canada's lands and oceans and reach net zero by 2050 should be very much in a coordinated step with our critical mineral strategy, understanding where we can take our exploration activities and where we can actually develop new assets is going to be inherently important. So I would argue we're behind the curve already. We need to do more to get in front of that curve, but it is only going to happen with coordination between government and with the people within Canada.
An opinion question. Can we meet those deadlines, those mandates?
We always like to ground our thoughts in evidence. I would suggest to Mr. Minister or Mr. MP, and when we think of the imperative here in Canada, just based on our current population base, Clean Energy Canada, another work group here in Ontario, did a study last year that suggested somewhere around 113 dams, the size of the Site C dam in BC, would be required for Canada to reach net zero. And when we think of 2050 in the calendar, that means we would have to build a dam about every 3 months here in Canada. And so that would suggest already the fact that we're not doing those types of electrical transition infrastructure development, that we're already behind the curve. And it'll be a challenge for us to meet 2050 based on what we have here in Canada from an infrastructure and what we have here from a mineral base.
That's thank you very much. I have less than a minute left, but when we are looking at rare minerals, I know one of the countries that we compete against internationally is China, and when the opportunity is there to extract these important minerals, if the Canadians don't do it, maybe the Chinese are going to do it. I was wondering if you could compare the environmental and accountability measures that the Canadian companies have against some of our competitors, such as China. And if we need these minerals, do you think Canada is better placed to extract them in a very environmentally sound manner versus some of these other countries?
Somehow a brief answer, sir.
From a broad stroke basis, Mr. Carey, yes, Canadian companies operate in a much more transparent and above board perspective relative to a Chinese company or a state-owned enterprise from China.
Much. Mr. Varani for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks. I want to thank all of the witnesses. I'll direct some of my questions to Ms. Coumans and Mr. Thompson, but a bit of a preamble. Obviously, you've heard different types of questions from some of the witnesses here. One thing that's critically is clear, pardon the pun, is that the race for critical minerals is on. So mining's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's probably just going to intensify around the planet, particularly on the continent of Africa. And our biggest competitor there is China, as I think we all know. And what we're trying to do is ensure that the mining that continues, that exists right now, but the mining that continues is done to a better standard. And I think you're going to find probably unanimity here that things can be done better. And I say that as a parliamentarian, also as a former human rights lawyer, and also as the parliamentary secretary to Minister Ng. I'll say to Mining Watch and to Oxfam that I think you're seeking further powers, further roles, further responsibilities, and I think that's completely fair. I think it's also fair and should be clear to Canadians and to parliamentarians about what we've done and what we're doing so far. I think the Towards Sustainable Mining initiative is a good one, and the fact that we led on that and now 9 countries are participating. I think the fact that we created a core, I appreciate you have concerns about the core's powers, but the fact that we have a core and we're the only nation on earth that has one, I think is important. I think the fact that they've already started receiving cases, there are 13 so far, and they've launched a government study that they're hoping to publish soon. I think those are important steps. I think it's also important when you talk about gender inclusivity to acknowledge on trade, Mr. Thompson, that we are the government that was responsible for having a gender chapter included in the renegotiation of CUSMA. So I think we are working to take steps, but I candidly take with open and good faith your criticisms that more needs to be done and you want it to be done quicker. So apropos of all of that, I guess what I'm wondering about is that in particular on something that I personally worked on, which is the relaunch of the responsible business conduct strategy, we tried to give that some incentives. And one of the incentives I'm talking about, and there's a question to both Ms. Coumans and Mr. Thompson, is that we said you will be deprived of Trade Commissioner services unless you agree to abide by this new strategy. So trying to give it a quid for the quo, so to speak. I guess, Ms. Coumans, I'm quite concerned by the fact that you said you're not able to access which companies operating abroad have signed on to previous integrity declarations. Can you give us your opinion about this quid pro quo that we included in the new RBC strategy? And secondly, are you able to access right now whether company A operating abroad has signed on to such an undertaking pursuant to that new RBC code of conduct? So over to you, Ms. Coumans.
Yes, there's a number of things. Just to answer your immediate question, no, we can still not access that information. In fact, I've just recently been in touch, and we are constantly in touch with embassies. When we find human rights abuses, environmental abuses, we very often alert embassies. We never get a call back saying, actually, we're very concerned about this, come and talk to us. We have to push if we get a meeting at all. I'm dealing with Baru Gold in Indonesia on a very small island right now, and wanted to know whether Baru Gold had signed an integrity agreement with the embassy in Indonesia in Jakarta, and was told that information was confidential. So that answers your question. But to just briefly correct something, I think we've all been talking talking about the upcoming mining boom in relation to energy transition, minerals and metals. I think now is exactly the time before this boom happens, or as it's starting to happen, that we strengthen the instruments we have, both the non-judicial instrument, the core, but also the judicial instrument that we need. And I want to make it really clear that towards sustainable mining and E3 Plus are voluntary mechanisms. I've now heard it again misstated before a committee that 9 countries have adopted this legislation. That is incorrect. Countries and nations do not adopt this legislation. This is not mandatory. It is mining associations that are adopting these standards and chambers of commerce.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Coomans. I just want to give Mr. Thompson just a chance to jump in. Yeah. Can you just comment on the due diligence standard? There's lots of things floating out there. 211, John McKay's bill, is coming out of committee. There's the potential Peter Julian bill. There's also the mandate given to Minister O'Regan. Do you have a preferred vehicle amongst those 3 for how we get a due diligence standard legislated, Mr. Thompson?
That is going to be the key, is moving beyond the strategies that Global Affairs Canada has had for a number of years and actually to bring about legislation. Whether it comes through a private member's bill or a government bill, I think the important thing is to cover all human rights in all sectors of the economy and to build in that redress for people who have been, whose human rights have been harmed. If I had my way about it, I would prefer a government bill. I think the government has made a commitment to bring in a bill to protect people's human rights when Canadian companies operate abroad, and I would like to see them follow through on that. I think I'm pleased that Mr. Julian took the initiative to table legislation that could be a model, that could be picked up by the government and implemented. I think his bill has everything that we need to bring about a comprehensive due diligence framework.
Thank you to both of you for your very important testimony. Thank you.
Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, Madame Coumans.
Thank you, Ms. Coumans, once again. In a report published in 2022, the Justice in Corporate Accountability Project mentions serious violent actions by a Canadian firm, and that this has harmed human health. According to the report, the activities of certain public servants in 2010 and 2011 that aimed to defend the rights of the mining industry have had an effect on the Maya indigenous groups. As far as you're aware, is this the only case that we have documented where Canadian public servants worked in a way that prevent victims of violence to be heard?
That case has been extremely well documented and is an incredibly important case. That's the case against Goldcorp, in which Goldcorp was asked by the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights to cease operations because of the concerns that the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights had for the human rights abuses of the Mayan people at the Goldcorp mine, the Marlin mine. So it was the government of Guatemala that was asked to issue what they call precautionary measures, which is to stop the operation of the mine. Immediately on the weekend, the embassy in Guatemala got in touch with Ottawa, and actions were undertaken. This came out through access to information documents to protect the interests of Goldcorp. And those were extensive, and they've now been detailed in that report. We know that this happens all the time. We bring complaints and concerns into the public realm as soon as an issue is elevated to the fact that it's in the media in Canada. We see embassies go into action. We see ambassadors go out and cut ribbons. We see even op-eds being written by ambassadors saying that this is a great company, that Canada has its full support from Canada. We see embassies jump into action when Canadian companies are threatened through reputational risk because of their human rights and environmental impacts. So we see this all the time. It hasn't been documented as well as that report, but it will be.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Cannings, please.
Well, thank you. I don't know whose alarm that was, but I would just like to continue on with Ms. Coumans. You know, we've heard lines of questioning here from both the Conservatives and the Liberals that emphasize the need for mining. I'm I'm very much behind the need for mining for various reasons, not just the things we have to do to fight climate change. I was the natural resources critic for 6 years for the NDP, so I know PDAC well, I know MAC well. But the context of these questions seem to be we can't do mining without, and at the same time protect human rights and the environment, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about measures that would help us make sure that we protected human rights and the environment while Canadian companies are mining abroad. And I'm just wondering if I could get a fairly quick answer from you on, can we do this? Can we still do the mining we need, get the materials we need, and protect human rights and the environment?
Just to briefly respond to the fact that there's a major argument right now that in order to have the energy transition that we need to do more mining. And we would really oppose that idea. There will have to be some new mining, but there needs to be far, far more recycling and technology developed, especially for batteries that doesn't rely very heavily on metals. And that is happening. The battery industry is moving in that direction. They are no longer wanting to use cobalt and many of the other metals that we're still pushing companies to go and mine. That number one. But number two, the only way that mining can be done better, and I'm speaking from 23 years of experience and watching TSM and watching E3 Plus, these voluntary measures from the government of Canada, the voluntary measures from the industry associations, they don't work. We really need measures that have more teeth. So we really need mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence legislation. And this is where things are moving in Europe. France has already passed such legislation. The European Union is considering it right now. Canada really needs to get serious. We can't take small baby steps anymore. S211 doesn't go nearly far enough. It doesn't consider all human rights, and it doesn't actually ask companies to stop using slave labor.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Martel, please, for 5 minutes.
Oui, merci. Alors, je remercie.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to our witnesses. I have a question for Ms. McDonald and maybe Ms. Cummins as well. In Canada, we have the means to ensure that our laws are complied with. What would be most efficient so that our laws be complied with as well outside of the country? Ms. McDonald, if you'd like to begin.
Ms. McDonald may have left. So, okay, Mr. Meadow, just hold on. I want to make sure you have your time. And I don't think Ms. McDonald, they had told us they had just over an hour, and I think that hour is up and they've left. So I'm assuming Ms. McDonald is no longer with us, or her colleague. Neither one of them are with us. So Mr. Martel, we're going to start over again with your questioning and start your 5 minutes over, and you can direct your question.
Dr. Coumans and Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, Dr. Coumans and Mr. Thompson are the ones that are here from Oxfam and from Mining Watch Canada.
Madame Coumans.
Ms. Coumans is here. Okay, so Ms. Coumans, I'd like to ask you a question. Ms. Coumans, in your opinion, the definition of a Canadian mining company is what, in your opinion?
So there's various definitions, but the most basic one is a company that is headquartered in Canada.
J'aimerais savoir aussi parce que
I'd also like to know, because in Canada we have the means to ensure that our laws are complied with, but what about outside the country? What is different compared with inside the country? Of course, we have different resources, but what could be improved outside of the country so that our laws are complied with?
Yes, that's a really important question, and that goes to the core of what we're talking about today. So right now, Canada cannot enforce its laws and rules that we have for mining in Canada we can't extend those laws and rules to mining overseas. But what we can do is we can require of any company that's a Canadian company that's headquartered in Canada to do what we call environmental and human rights due diligence. So this means that that company is now required by law to review all of the operations of all of its subsidiaries and contractors to see if possibly these operations are harming human rights or the environment. And then the company has to report on the risk assessment that they've done. But it goes beyond that, because this is sort of like 211 right now on slave labor and child labor, just the reporting requirement. But on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, once they've reported on it, they have to also show what they've done to mitigate or to stop the harm that they're doing. So if they're using slave labor, because we have two Canadian companies right now in the Uyghur territory in China that are very likely using slave, not just report that they are or possibly are, but that they have to stop. And then there's the final piece, which is that if people are harmed by a Canadian company, they can bring a case to Canadian court. This suite of sanctions and issues and encouragements, because this is really to prevent harm, we believe will actually really force the industry to change the way it operates, because it actually has consequences. Unlike towards sustainable mining or E32, these voluntary measures have no consequences. And there have to be consequences for companies to take it seriously.
On parle de l'ombudsman.
We were speaking of the ombudsperson. What I'd like to know is, have you witnessed a case where the ombudsman contributed to the change of certain mining practices outside of the country?
Up till now, no. So she's been operating for 5 years. She has not completed any cases yet. We know that there are at least 2 cases in front of her. These are cases of 2 Canadian mining companies that are operating in China in the Uyghur territories. And the concern is that they are possibly, maybe likely, using slave labor in their operations. So we will see how she does on that case. But so far in 5 years, she has not completed any cases on any mining operations overseas.
Il me reste combien?
How much time do I have left? 1 minute? Okay. I would have liked to have heard your perspective. I'd like to know, why do mining companies decide to go work outside of the country instead of here in Canada, seeing as we have the same resources here?
That's a very good question. We have many. Canada actually is very rich in minerals, and we do have many of the resources here. I don't know. I wish you could have asked that question of our exploration PDAC friends, but they've left. I don't know why they go abroad, but what companies will tell you is we go where the resources are. So they're always looking for lucrative ore bodies, and they will go anywhere. They will go onto tiny islands in the Pacific. They'll go into glaciers, and so I don't think they want to be restricted to any one country.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Miao for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses for joining us today on this important issue. First, I'd like to address my question to Mr. Thompson on how does Oxfam Canada work with Canadian mining companies and other stakeholders to promote best practices and regulations to protect the environment, especially and also human rights in the context of mining?
Question. As I mentioned in my presentation, Oxfam is a global network of people working to end inequality and poverty. So we are engaging with Canadian companies in numerous countries and Canadian embassies in numerous countries to see how Canadian mining can become a force for good instead of a force that is harming people and further impoverishing communities. So we do believe that the solutions have to originate here in Canada, and that a human rights due diligence framework will set the bar for how our companies operate in many, many jurisdictions around the world. And we'll also send a signal to the Canadian embassies that have been referred to earlier that there are minimum standards that are required of Canadian companies, and that we need to make that enforceable. That's been the big gap to date. We also have partners in other countries who have come to testify at committee to say that they won't bring a complaint to the core ombudsperson office until it gets stronger powers. So I think they do recognize the importance of an accountability mechanism in Canada. They want to use an accountability mechanism in Canada, but we have not provided one yet.
And with those, what are the chances of driving mining company to relocate their headquarters outside of Canada rather than continuing their Canadian identity of running business?
Well, I think we've heard a lot today about competitiveness. And I think that we're beyond the point where Canada and Canadian companies will be competing on their technical expertise. I think technical expertise exists in many countries around the world. So what is going to distinguish us when a government in another nation is trying to decide who will help them in developing their mineral resources? I do think that having a robust framework of saying we are a country that has human rights standards, that has environmental standards, and they apply to our companies when they operate abroad, if Canada is in competition with others in order to build the mines of tomorrow, this has to be part of our competitive advantage. And I think that's what's missing right now, is that we don't have that comprehensive framework in Canada where we can go around the world and we can say our companies will operate responsibly. That could become our calling card if we were to introduce a comprehensive framework that applies to every Canadian company. The voluntary systems, as Ms. Coumans correctly pointed out, companies can pick and choose whether they pick up the E3 plus system of the PDAC or not. Some may not. We don't know how many are actually implementing that system. It's not clear to me because it's completely voluntary. So what we need to do is raise the bar for all companies, and I think that can become our calling card internationally, and will make host communities have more confidence with the companies they're relating with. Today, when you meet people from host communities, they speak to people from other communities who've hosted a Canadian mine, and there are horror stories they hear. They hear about all of these atrocities and these abuses, and why would a community invite us in to develop their mineral resources with this sort of track record?
Thank you for sharing that. And with the long-term goals you mentioned of Oxfam Canada in this area, how do you plan to achieve them?
We do believe that having a people-centered approach to development is key. And so local people have to have the information about the projects that are being proposed in their area, and they also need to be able to exercise the right to decide whether and how projects are developed. So this community consent is critical for us as Oxfam, and is something that we're promoting with governments around the world. It's also an important part of reviewing and assessing projects that come forward. So we're also working with the Government of Canada and governments in other countries in improving impact assessment processes, because we do believe a strong impact assessment process will lead to a better project in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. On to Mr. Seaback for 5 minutes, please. 5 minutes. I've got you down.
I'll take it. If I could, Madam Chair.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Thank you. I'll just follow up. Like my colleagues and I have been talking. Ms. Kuzma, you raised the example of the two studies or the two cases that were being looked at now by CORE of happening in China. Now, for my understanding, would that be, for example, in your estimation, like a company that says headquartered itself in Canada for the tax benefits, the nameplate, but is primarily a Chinese company operating in China?
Actually, no. One of these companies also has an operation in Canada, has or had an operation in Canada, and also one in the US, if I'm not mistaken. So, no, this is a company that's also operating in other jurisdictions.
When those reports or investigatory actions are going to be, like when reports are going to be developed and submitted for those?
Yes, the process of the Corps while she's investigating cases is a rather oblique. So I don't really know where this is going, how that's going to be investigated. But it is now her obligation if she takes, I think she has taken these cases, that she's going to have to investigate somehow whether or not these two companies, these two Canadian mining companies operating in the Uyghur district in China are actually using slave labor. I'm not quite sure how she's going to do that.
Mr. Thompson and Ms. Kuzman, last April, the government launched a new responsible business conduct strategy, actually making a difference this time. Are you concerned that this is, again, just another Liberal promise? The government's April 22 announcement reads, the new responsible business conduct strategy was completed following extensive public consultation. So I want to hear from you both. Were you consulted as part of that?
In the public consultation, and we urged the government to take a legislative route, not to continue on with their renewal of this strategy that has been the focus for so many years.
Great, thank you. Ms. Kuzma, can you respond as well?
Yeah, the same actually. We were also and we also strongly urged that's to, set out some standards and ask companies to voluntarily comply with those standards.
Madam Chair, any further time? Okay, just one last question to both witnesses, if I could. I guess nearly 4 years later, the advisory body to CORE has not met, I believe, since November of last year. Now, is there any actions taking place with that advisory council to your knowledge at all?
I'm not aware that it even met in November of last year. I don't know that it's met at all since we all left, since civil society and the unions left. I don't know if I know they were trying to reconstitute it. I'm not sure if that actually happened. And I have no idea what it's doing, if anything.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, that's my question.
Mr. Sheehan for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much to the presenters as well as to Mr. Savard Tremblay for bringing forward this study and the study, title how Canadian mining companies are operating abroad and dealing with human rights, environment, and a whole bunch of matters. So, merci beaucoup. My question.
So, thank you very much.
Took this, and perhaps I'll direct it at Mining Watch, and maybe Mr. Thompson, if you could update us. We've talked about a number of these countries where these atrocities are happening that we're undertaking to as a government to help eradicate them through legislation that we're currently working on, and it's in the mandate letter of 4 cabinet ministers, including Seamus O'Regan, and that work is underway. Those consultations are happening, and this information will help inform further. But one of the things that I started to think about today is where are we at if you have this information with Canadian mining companies related to Russia and the Russian sanctions, because there were a number of Canadian mining companies that were operating in Russia, sometimes through a joint venture, sometimes by themselves. So if you would have any information or updates about the sanctions, some of the Canadian companies like Kinross was operating there, I believe, as well. So perhaps I'll start with Ian in the room, and then I'll go online to Mining Watch too as well. If you could sort of give us a perspective where we're at and how the sanctions are working against this illegal, horrendous war that is also killing people and resulting in rapes and a whole bunch of horrible things. So please, let's speak to that issue, and I'll start with Mr. Thompson.
I regret that as Oxfam, we don't have much involvement with mining activities in Russia or tracking the activities of Canadian companies operating mines in Russia. So I can't really comment or answer your question.
That's fair enough. Just wanted to see if I get an update. And Mining Watch, do you have any information on the Canadian mining companies in Russia?
Yeah, we were following Kinross, and as you mentioned, Kinross actually left Russia. It took a while, but they did leave. So that was the main company that we were following. What we're also concerned about is what the products of mines that have ownership by oligarchs, where those products end up. So there's a private company called Deep Sea Mining Finance that is owned by a Russian oligarch, and they want to mine in the deep sea waters off the coast of Papua New Guinea and process those metals in China, and then those metals would be sold on the open market. And whether Canadian companies are involved in buying those metals that are owned by a mine that was owned by an oligarch, that's where it gets more complicated. And I'd like to see what Canada can do to track those metals and make sure that we don't buy metals or trade in metals that have been mined by Russian companies overseas.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your work. And on Mining Watch, you'd mentioned a number of countries and places that you're concerned with. How do you measure any potential changes that happen in those countries? What are your matrices, and just so I can help me understand how to view this and how we can, do a better job in analysis, those sort of analyses, and what kind of work, if you want to delve into it, which you do to sort of move the yardsticks forward in those countries, and you give us some examples as well.
Yes, so I did name an awful lot of issues, and I named a lot of countries. All of those issues that I named and all of those countries that I named are cases that we actually work on and have worked on in Mining Watch over 23 years. And I will be detailing some of those in a brief that we will provide this committee. It's really difficult to say anything more about matrices than to say that year over year, we're finding the number of cases that are coming before us, and these are new cases. These are cases of people being harmed this year, or last year. It's relentless. We had hoped in the 20 years that we've now been operating, over 20 years, that we would see an improvement. This is almost a failing on our part. We feel sometimes that we haven't been able to, through our work with communities and through our efforts to publicize these concerns, to raise them with the Canadian government, to bring people to Canada, to speak to parliamentarians, to speak to civil servants. We had hoped that there would be more improvement, and there isn't. The problem is as big as it's ever been. And now with the coming mining boom, we're really dreading how this is going to increase the workload even more. And the workload is not the problem. The problem is the actual harm being done to people. And I just want to emphasize, this is not just, it's not a few bad apples. And it's not just the small companies that don't have any resources to pay for doing things the right way. One of the companies we work on is Barrick Gold, and Barrick Gold has just been sued in November of last year in Canadian court. And what is it for? It's for people who've been shot and killed by mine security, by police guarding Barrick's mine in Tanzania. This is almost the biggest gold mining company in the world. I think it's now the second biggest gold mining company in the world. It has plenty of resources to do things right. And this is the third time that Barrick has been sued over these same issues at this same mine. So there was a court case filed in 2013, which was settled in 2015. There was another court case filed in 2020, which is ongoing in the UK. And now there's been another case filed in Canada over the same issues: human rights abuses, excess use of force by mine security and police guarding the mine on behalf of Barrick.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cummins. I'm sorry, the time is up. On to Monsieur Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, Madame Cummins.
Yes, Ms. Cummins. You'll be The last person that I speak to, I'd like you to speak about the regulations for state investors, and I know that this has been included in some different agreements that allows foreign investors to speak to the court for democratically adopted decisions that would have a harmful effect on certain companies. In 2021, in committee, we saw that the Liberals, the Bloc, and the Conservatives didn't have the same opinion on this. But according to a 2010 article from Politique Alternative, this is now the most common tool that is used by foreign investors. 42 Canadian investors have submitted complaints through this mechanism. So taking other companies from outside of the country to court. 86% of countries that are targeted by this are developing countries. So this excludes the Canada-Mexico agreement. Can you tell us more about these mechanisms? Do you think that we should continue with this?
I'm afraid I'm not entirely clear what the mechanisms are that you're talking about. Are you talking about the international or the ISDS cases?
Exactement, oui.
Oh,
yes, exactly.
Great. Yeah, and so this is really important because we heard earlier that Canadian mining companies could possibly have a competitive disadvantage if they were held to a higher standard by Canada. And Mr. Thompson very clearly said, in fact, they would have a better chance of accessing ore bodies if they were held to a higher standard in Canada. What we're starting to see is that countries are trying to get rid of Canadian mining companies because of the harm that they've caused. So in Papua New Guinea, for example, there's a Canadian mine there called the Porgera mine. It's another Barrick gold mine. Barrick operated there for over 20 years. When the lease came up for renewal, the Papua New Guinea government said no. There have been so many human rights abuses. There's been so much environmental damage. The waste from that mine goes directly into a river system. There's no impoundment. There's no containment at all. And there have been egregious human rights abuses at that mine. And so the Papua New Guinea government said, no, we're not going to renew the lease. And you would think that a sovereign government would have the right to decide not to renew a lease when the lease has come up and it's been finalized. And Barrick fought this first in the courts in Papua New Guinea and then filed an ISDS case with the World Bank. And thereby forced the hand of a very poor government. And when the Papua New Guinea government finally said, okay, fine, we'll renew your lease, they actually said that they didn't have the resources to fight this legal battle.
Thank you very much,
very
Dr.
problematic.
Cummins. Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that with Ms. Cummins. Just, in my years of being here, sitting on the Natural Resources Committee, we did a study on the involvement of Indigenous communities in natural resource extraction here in Canada. And we repeatedly heard from mining companies who brought up, I think with some pride, in fact a lot of pride in many cases, of the advances they'd made in Canada regarding impact benefit agreements with communities, making sure the communities were involved from the start, making sure that those Indigenous communities benefited from the activities on their territories. And yet we have this disconnect with how these same companies seem to be operating abroad, or at least we have a disconnect with, their concern about having this same amount of oversight on their activities abroad. And I'm just wondering if perhaps, Ms. Gubin, you can talk about this. Where does that concern come from? You would think these companies would want to carry that pride to all their activities.
Yes, certainly we would. That's what we would hope, and that's what we would wish for. I've heard mining companies respond to this kind of question by saying, well, we just follow the laws of the country where we operate. And if we don't have to do these things, then we don't have to do them. We just follow the laws. And in fact, that is all that Canada has required of our mining companies. All that Canada does require is that our mining companies follow the laws of the country where they're operating, not live up to a higher standard. And so the only way to address this problem from Canada is to implement something like mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, because that's something we have control over. We can't, obviously, and we wouldn't want to control the laws of other countries. Many of these are developing countries. Many of these are very poor countries. We're talking about places like Papua New Guinea, where our Canadian mining companies are operating. We can't tell the Papua New Guineans what standards they should put on our companies. And often our companies get around those standards anyway for various reasons. But what we can do is we can mandate through legislation that our companies do environmental and human rights due diligence, that they assess the risk that their operations and their operations of their subsidiaries are putting people and the environment to, and then to report on that risk and to tell us what they've done to stop that harm from being done. And if that doesn't work, then people can sue in Canada. And quite frankly, when lawsuits are filed, it does sharpen the attention of the lawyers in the corporations and the managers of the corporations, because now, they're actually being sued and this could have real consequences. So that is something Canada can do and we should do.
Okay, thank you very much. To the members, I don't know if the official opposition has any questions. If not, do you have a question? We have time to do another
2 minutes?
round of questions if either came. Mr. Barani?
I guess I had two questions for Mr. Thompson and Ms. Coumans. And again, thank you very much for your detailed work, for your commitment to this issue. And I'll ask them both at the same time. One, Ms. Coumans, is that you've outlined a lot of the litigation that's already taking place. And then again, you've got my legal brain thinking. But you also outlined that under a more rigorous due diligence standard, you would want an entrenched cause of action. And I guess I'm just wondering if litigation is already being commenced many, many times, including against specific companies on repeated bases. Are there already enough established causes of action, or is this forum nonconvenience argument the one you're seeking to sort of supersede with legislation? So that's the first question. And the second question is just literally on a brainstorming sort of lens, is that if you take Mr. Canning's point at face value, and I do, about Indigenous communities, we've passed legislation that relates to UNDRIP in this country. UNDRIP is obviously a UN protocol that relates to Indigenous people around the planet. The UNDRIP legislation that we passed calls for annual reporting, but I'm just wondering, could one interpretation of the annual reporting requirement be to compel reporting about what's happening with Indigenous communities abroad that are being affected by Canadian companies? I'm not sure if this has been thought about or whether that even fits squarely with the legislation, but I just put that out there for your thoughts. Thank you. So either of you, Mr. Thompson or Ms. Coumans.
Maybe I'll just start with the court cases question. So what I really wanted to emphasize by mentioning these court cases is how few cases have been brought, given that those cases that have been brought are the tip of the iceberg of the actual harm. So since 1997, we've only had 8 court cases brought. 2 of those were dismissed on the forum issue. 3 are ongoing at the moment. 2 were settled out of court. So the Nevsing case on slave labor in Eritrea was settled out of court, and the Tahoe case was also settled out of court. And now the Barrett case has just been filed. So we definitely have seen the issue of forum been the reason why 2 cases were dismissed, and they were dismissed to Guyana, where the case never went ahead, and to the Congo, where the case also never went ahead. And these were both quite serious cases, but they weren't heard on the merits of the case in Canada because they were just dismissed on forum. So this is a serious hurdle.
Any comment from either of you on the UNDRIP point, just about protection of Indigenous folks abroad? I appreciate it's not just Indigenous communities in various parts of the world, but sometimes it is. Does that have any connection here, do you think? Or
Well, I think
maybe I'll just... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go first and then Ms. Coumans. I would say the UN human rights bodies have repeatedly taken Canada to task over the impact of Canadian mining companies on Indigenous peoples in other countries. So if Canada were to report on that under the new legislation, I don't know if that would be anything new. I think what we're hoping for is that some of the recommendations that have come from those UN human rights bodies to actually take action and bring in stronger human rights frameworks in Canada to regulate that activity would be more significant than reporting under the new act. And I also think as the Trade Committee, getting back to the point around the agreements that Canada is signing with other countries, the foreign investor protection agreements, which often preclude governments from introducing more robust environmental or human rights standards and lock in legislation at the time of the agreement or when a mining contract is awarded, really prevents governments, as Ms. Coumans alluded to in Papua New Guinea and in other countries, of actually raising their own standards, which is highly problematic. So I think Canada reviewing its foreign investor protection agreement template agreement that we use again and again and again to entrench and strengthen corporate rights would be a significant step forward.
All right, I want to thank the
Yes.
witness. What, did you want to make a comment quickly?
I'll
Dr.
just quick add one thing to what was just said, in that this mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence that we've been talking about, one of the requirements would be that companies would report on how they are treating Indigenous peoples in their global operations. So UNDRIP would come in. It would be one of the things that they would have to report against in their global operations.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. I think we've completed the questions. We have to go in camera for a discussion about possible travel upcoming. So again, thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Thompson, Dr. Coumans. Thank you very much. I will suspend.
Thank you to the committee.
I will suspend while we go in camera.